Good morning, friends. Thank you for taking time to spend with me and my beloved Lisa. She's sitting across the table from me. So if you catch me casting my gaze that way, you have to give me a little grace today. We are going to get right into our teaching. We started last week with doing a kind of a compare and contrast and asking or answering a question Paul asked the Galatian church when he said this. He said, "You foolish Galatians, who has distorted your perception, bringing you under their influence?" Now, I think the NASB says, "You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you?" We made a little progress on that bewitching last week. And we started to look at the law back in Leviticus and making this statement that basically, I'll just summarize it. Bewitching is inevitable if you don't start right. We talked about going out of my house, going to my job. If I turned left instead of right, even though my intentions are good, I'm never going to get to where I'm going. If I start off wrong, I can't end right. And we talked about that, and I want to take another pass at that this week. We're gonna do another compare and contrast. Basically, instead of looking at Mr. Witherington's book with Mr. Heiser's, today I want to read to you a little out of my own personal book. This is the Galatians book I wrote. It's called Galatians: Paul's Response to the Letter of James. It's got Kelly and Lisa there on the back. You can see us. There's the ISBN number if you want to order it. But I'm going to take an excerpt out of that today, and I'm going to read out of this book that I've already introduced about 3 weeks ago. And here's what we're going to do today. We're going to pray, and we're going to get right into this compare and contrast because, the objective, what Paul is making his argument about is you were taught right and then you deviated. And he's trying to say, look at what you were taught and then examine who led you in a different direction. And, the whole letter is about get back on track, right? So we're going to do a little of that ourselves today. So let's pray. Lord Jesus, we invite you into our hearts, into our minds, and into our lives. Lord, over these teachings, give us help from heaven to know the will of God and to be given the wisdom to act upon it. And we thank you in advance for what you're doing. In your precious name, amen. Okay, I'm going to start with a little statement I made. I said the first century church, the meaning that they have depends greatly upon what backdrop you're in possession of prior to reading the text. These are my own notes. In other words, bewitching begins when you aren't in possession of the same mindset that the first century authors, whether it be Peter, John, Matthew, we lean so heavily in this generation, our modern teaching, on things like the Catholic confessions, the commentaries of John Calvin, Martin Luther's teachings, the councils, the decrees, the councils of Trent, on and on and on. We kind of glean from those documents, and then we develop our teaching or our doctrines based upon that. Well, the first century church didn't have the Catholic catechisms. They didn't have Luther. They didn't have anything that we draw from. What they had is, drum roll please, they had the book of Enoch. They had the book of Jasher. They had the book of Jubilee. They had a lot of different writings, and we've already hashed this out. They would not say this. They would not look and pull out the book of Enoch in a church service and say, this is equal to Isaiah. They would say in the first century, Joel is an inspired book. Genesis Exodus, Leviticus. These are inspired doctrinal things that Enoch and Jubilees and the wisdom of Solomon, they're not on par with that. But what they do serve is they help inform us about the inspired book. So it's like they're saying they're useful. But in our time, we have replaced these, what they used to draw from and write their inspired scriptures. We've not even been encouraged to even read them, let alone examine them and help inform us when we read their letters. Instead, we rush to our commentaries written by people in the modern era, and we kind of miss out on a lot. And what happens is bewitching occurs. You get steered away from everything that they gleaned from. You'll never you'll spend your lifetime, you'll never hear anybody read from the book of Enoch in the church service. You just won't have it. And partly they've got a good point, because a lot of these things have been edited, like Second Enoch and Third Enoch. There's a lot of editing. A lot of people have done some redacting throughout the centuries, and it's just kind of corrupted some of it. But the first book of Enoch is pretty well preserved. You'd have to look at what's called the Ethiopic, the Bible of Ethiopia. That's where it was preserved in its original content, by the way. A lot of people don't know that. But we want to get that back. And here's the reason I'm saying that, because when Paul is writing chapter 3, you foolish Galatians, and he writes down through there to the point where he says in the 19th verse of that chapter, why then the law? Why are we trying to incorporate the law into the new covenant? And then he just says, okay, well, before we get there, what was the purpose of God giving us the law? And he starts to answer that question on the backside. We spent a lot of time there last week. And the idea that we captured last week was, the writers of the book of Leviticus, they were under the impression that we have to preserve the teaching regarding sacred space. But now we, leaning on a different group of sources, we're always taught that the law is doing this the whole time, pointing at you. You're sinful. Don't do this. You're going to get caught. Don't move this boundary marker. You're unclean. You're unholy. What they're not really teaching about, and we taught about it last week, has to do with God has carved out amongst the whole world, all the nations of the world, one nation, Israel, for himself. And he was teaching them, you and I do not interact equally. I'm not like you. And we bet a lot of time, I hate to keep talking about it, but I'm other. There's nothing there in my image now. After the expulsion and this separation, you are estranged from me. You live on this planet that has no representation of me. I made it. My signature is on everything, but we are not together now. You're estranged. You were banished from the garden, and nothing in that environment represents me. Therefore, make no graven images. Why? The other nations, they're carving out things like they're Greek sculptors. We want a god for Molech, Marduk, all these gods, Baal. Make them out of wood, make them out of marble, make them. God is saying, first of all, you don't have anything. You can't find me. You can't, I'm not represented. My image isn't in the form of a bird, a fish, nothing there. Therefore, let's start with this. I am just other than what you know. And if you are going to interact with me, we have to preserve sacred space. That's what Eden represented. We can only interact You with me, if you get this understanding through your head, I am not like other gods. These other cats that's out there, that's not part of us, they are under those gods. I am the Most High God. I am the God that made those gods. And they are not representing me, and they're not representing this government. But between you and me, we're going to have a law that's going to be put in place for a season. This is why Paul and James are fighting. That's why I wrote this book. Because when the season of Moses concludes, the Christ, the manifested being of me, is going to come into the world. When Christ comes, the law and the season it represented, it's been fulfilled. It's just sunset. Now, the big fight between James and Paul is James doesn't want to let go of the law. He wants to, kind of like Star Trek, he wants to transport it into the new covenant. Paul is saying, if you bring that covenant into this covenant, that's the famous saying, he said, a little leaven leavens the whole lump. And most people are taught, well, he's talking about if you sin just a little bit. He had nothing, he just wasn't focused on that. He was trying to keep the law out. He was saying it's concluded, it served its purpose. Now that Jesus is ascended, it's time to go get all the nations. We can now fulfill the covenant God made with Abraham for all the nations. So therefore, Israel is no longer it no longer has a special place. It is one nation amongst all the nations now. And now that all authority has been given to Jesus in heaven, we now can go get all the nations recaptured according to faith, not the law. So that's kind of the backdrop. So I'm saying Paul is drawing off the book of Enoch in chapter 3 and chapter 4. And you really need to know that, because if you're not aware of the writing of Enoch, you won't even see the contrast. And here's let me see if I wrote it down here. I did. Some sources that are very helpful. You remember the Unseen Realm, the book. I showed you that. Now there's another writing, and I want you to look this up. I had it and I forwarded it to some people, but it was by a guy named Tyler Stewart. And here's the title of his paper. It was called Fallen Angels, Bastard Spirits, and the Cosmic Content of Galatians 3. And a lot of what Michael Heiser wrote about in the Unseen Realm, he cites this man's writing as his source. And a lot of it's in this message today. So keep that in mind, that he's making his argument in his paper, that not only is Paul knowledgeable about First Enoch, he's drawing from it in this third chapter, because he's expecting that he knows that these readers of his Galatian letter, they've already read First Enoch. They're very, very well aware of it. Now, here's some, just to give you a little taste, here's column A, here's the fallen watchers, and here's column B. Here's the Son of God, Jesus. Here's some contrast to begin with. The sons of God in the book of the Watchers, they're the original rebels from heaven. Okay, I'll read to you from Enoch. This is chapter 6. Now he's writing this. Now tell me if this doesn't sound almost word for word of Galatians chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. When human beings started to multiply, beautiful daughters were born to them. The angels, who are the sons of heaven, saw the women and desired them. They said to one another, let us choose wives from among these human daughters and have children with them. Shem-Jaza, who was their leader, said he was afraid that they would not all go through with it and that he alone would be punished for a great sin. But they answered him, let us all swear an oath and bind ourselves together to make this plan happen. So they swore together and made a binding agreement. There were 200 of them in total, and they came down in the days of Jared to the top of Mount Hermon. Now, Jared, J in Hebrew, I already know is Yared, and the word Yared means literally to go down. So he's being named that because they're marking the era of his birth, and they're saying when this cat was born is the same time that these guys came down here. That's what he's saying. They called it Hermon because this is where they made their oath and bound themselves with a promise. Okay, let me go and read chapter 7 too. All the others took wives, each one choosing for himself, and they began to defile themselves with these women. They taught them charms and spells, how to cut roots, and how to understand plants. They're just teaching them how to get high. Okay? The women became pregnant and gave birth to giants who were 3,000 ells tall, which this is one of the reasons why I said you got to watch the editing, because this was an editorial thing. They were, that's way too tall. I mean, that's monstrous big. But the Bible just says there are giants in the land in those days. And it said, these giants consumed everything the people had. When people could no longer feed them, the giants turned against the people and started devouring them. And they also sinned against birds, animals, reptiles, fish, eating each other's flesh and drinking blood. Then the earth brought a charge against these lawless ones. Okay, so here you have the sons of God. This is what they're called in Genesis. The sons of God saw the daughters of men. And it's from the book of Daniel, chapter 4. We're not calling them watchers and we're just grabbing this name out of the air. This is what Daniel calls the divine counsel of God. It's back in the days of Daniel in chapter 4 that Daniel writes that a decree was being levied from the divine counsel of God. And he said a watcher came down to Nebuchadnezzar and said, this is a verdict from the divine counsel. A watcher came down and said, your mind's going to be taken from you for a season. You're going to be out there and your nails are going to grow like eagle's talons and your hair is going to grow like bird feathers. So the watchers and also Enoch calls them watchers. So I just wanted you to know I'm not making that word up. But I want you to get the contrast, because Paul is going to introduce in the 4th chapter of Galatians. When I read that, you're going to see there's going to be some things that's going to ring a bell, but you have to know this text first. So get the idea. A divine Son of God is coming down. Okay? What are they going to do? They're going to enter into human women. Okay? And what's going to come out of the women is going to be a race of giants. Now let's read what Paul is saying in Galatians chapter 4. And let me see how, I'll just start reading it. Like I said, this is my translation. But I say, as long as the inheritor is an infant, he does not differ at all from a slave, being master of all things. But instead, he is authoritatively under a caretaker and house manager until the pre-appointed time of the Father. Thusly also we, when we were infants, having been enslaved authoritatively under the spiritual stoics of this fallen world. Let's stop right there. Stoicheia. What is Paul saying about who are these spiritual stoics? Now that's my translation. I think the ESV calls them elemental spirits. But here's what Paul is talking about. This is the watchers right here that he's talking about. He says, Thusly, we also, being infants, having been enslaved authoritatively under the spiritual stoics of this fallen world. Now, he is absolutely leaning on Enoch right here, believing they understood the Watchers come down. They impregnate women. They create a race called the Nephilim. And then God, in response to that, he sends a flood. The flood wipes out the Nephilim, but being spiritual and flesh, the flesh dies, but the spiritual aspect of them is disembodied. And this is what he's referring to right here. The spiritual stoics of the fallen world are the disembodied Nephilim spirits that the New Testament writers are simply going to call them unclean spirits. The unclean spirits, aka demons, are right here. He said, look, before this, in this world that we share, there is a hierarchy. There are principalities, he calls them in Ephesians, demonic spirits and cosmic powers in heavenly places, he's going to say. But he's making this statement here in chapter 4, introducing them. Then he says, but when the completion of time came. Now here, follow his thinking. God sent forth his son, having born out from a woman. Now keep this in mind. Remember, we're doing a little contrast. Now you've got somebody else, a divine son, in the fullness of time. Now he's coming down. And instead of going into women, creating a race of giants, he's coming out from a woman. Do you see the distinction here? The contrast is absolutely essential that you see it. He came out from a woman born authoritatively under the law, in order that he might redeem those authoritatively under law, in order that we might receive back restored sonship. Two divine sons of God coming down. One is creating death. They're possessing people. They usher in disease, demonic possession, spiritual inhabitation that infects the mind. Now, here you see one other one coming down, and he's reversing the whole thing. It's a complete reversal. But now, if you're not aware of the book of Enoch, what are you going to take when you start reading this? Do you even see a contrast? Keep in mind, he's asking these questions to an audience. He's saying, who hath bewitched you? Where's the influence coming from? So now let's keep in mind now, divine sonship unites heaven from earth. Remember, this is a unification. Remember, Enoch is saying in the 6th chapter, they came down, divine sons, watchers, comes down from heaven to earth. They fathered giants of iniquity. And what does those giants bring? Chaos, death, demon possession. After the flood, they're disembodied spirits. And over in the New Testament, we're reading about entering into people, demonic possession. They attack humanity. They bring with their demon possession death, disease, sickness, etc., etc., etc. Do you see that? Okay. The watchers, if you keep reading that, when they are imprisoned, now here, let me read it because this is probably something that should be read. 2 Peter, it says, and if God did not spare, 2 Peter chapter 2, I'm going to read verse 4. And if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into Tartarus, they translated it hell, different meaning, don't have time today, and committed them to pits of darkness reserved for judgments, if he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a proclaimer of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the ungodly. So what are we saying right here? What you have to understand is when Enoch is writing, you got to see the contrast. The heavenly host, messengers of God, they're supposed to be interacting with humanity and bringing their prayer life to the Father. It's the exact opposite in Enoch's writing. Enoch is writing, these watchers fell, they were cast into prisons of gloomy darkness. But in his writing, and I'll have to paraphrase for time, he writes that they summon Enoch. They said, look, this guy walks with God. He's not your typical human. He has a relationship with God. Here's what we need to do. We need to make an appeal to Enoch. These are the original watchers that fell. It's not the Nephilim that they produced. It's the watchers, the 200. They summon Enoch in his writing. It's like chapter 30 or something. They say, look, we're sorry. We blew it. We made a mistake. Go back and ask the Father to forgive us. Now get the irony. Wait a minute. It's a good thing I wasn't Enoch, because I'd have been saying, hold it. You want me to intercede for you? You're the one, you had the special relationship in the divine council. The divine presence of God is your normal abode, but you left that abode. You abandoned sacred space and you corrupted our sacred space. You opened up a whole can of worms. Now you're asking me to go ask him, but Enoch being Enoch, not me, he does it. He goes back and God says, nope, they're toast. So he goes back and tells them, nada, can't do it. God says no. So get the division. Now, so here's Jesus. Jesus, but in contrast, gives himself to rescue humanity from what Paul calls this present evil age. Now remember what we read about. What did they do in chapter 7? Here's what they were doing that demands a better definition for transgression. We hear the word sin, transgression, trespass. We just kind of lump them all together. It's bad, bad, bad. No, that's not the right thing. A transgression is different. It's cousin to a trespass in that you bridge a boundary that has been set. That's what they're guilty of. They didn't just come into the celestial didn't just come into the terrestrial. In other words, they didn't just exit heaven and come into the natural world. They did much more than that. They accelerated the sin nature of man. They're saying, look, ladies, if you really want to do it right, let me teach you the art of seduction. Let me teach you how to paint your face a certain way. Let me teach you how to do some things very seductively. You're already sinning. We got that, but I'll make you a better sinner. You guys are living, you don't even know what this root does. If you roll this up and take this plant, you can have a euphoria. They're teaching them those kind of things. And then they said, and as far as that goes, the guys that don't want to be on with us, we can teach you how to forge metals and where to strike a human body just right so you can kill them much quicker. So in other words, it's like you're already sinning. We've already transgressed. We're going to teach you how to sin much better. We're going to be much better at it. And this is why Paul refers to this as this evil age, because the unclean spirits, they are still at work. Just go to any TV news network, go to any YouTube social media thing, whatever you want. These folks are being animated by the evil spirits of this fallen age. But Jesus, in contrast to that, a divine son, he exits heaven. He comes to the earth, but it's not a transgression. This is what Paul is saying. He comes here, and what does he do? He gives himself. He doesn't bring death and dismemberment and chaos. He brings with him everything of death, chaos, and I'm going to take it upon myself. I'm going to honor the Most High God, the Creator. I'm going to honor him. And so he rescues humanity, where the other sons of God, what did they do? Everything but, didn't they? After his ascension, he sends his Spirit. Now, when he dies, instead of his spirit leaving his body and becoming unclean spirits, what do you do with the Holy Spirit that exited his body? That's what he gives to us. We house the Holy Spirit. And instead of being possessed by unclean spirits, he's going to give his Spirit into the hearts of those people that are going to replace the fallen sons of God. That's why the teaching about faith is so important, because the seed of the Father is what is implanted in our hearts. This is what transforms you from their kingdom to God's kingdom, to being the son of the devil to being the son of God. Faith, faith, faith. What created the angelic realm mingling with women? What that seed created is all bad. What the seed of the Father, which is faith, created out from a woman is all good. You see the distinction. But women are important, because without them, you don't have either. And his Spirit gives us restored relationship via sonship. Do you see that? You see the distinction and the contrast? So all of that has to be kept in mind when you see this. Now, I'll say this much, and I'll say it this way. I don't think that there's this idea of being whole, W-H-O-L-E. God created man, and he says, I'll paraphrase it for time purposes, I want my image to be born there. I want my image to be born there as it is here. And here's how I want it to be done. I want it to be done through those human beings. I want image bearers on that earth. And the demonic, which the fallen watchers say, well, we too want our image. We want our image to be born there too. And what God did is he says, give me a man. And then after a while, I'm going to put him into a deep sleep. I'm going to remove something. And I'm going to take it away. And then I'm going to bring it back in the form of a woman. And he's going to say, now, one man cannot bear my image. He's no longer W-H-O-L-E. He's no longer whole. I took something from him. In order for my image to be reestablished there, you have to be whole. And that's so important, because that's the entirety of why God said we have to have a sacrifice. In Leviticus 1, he says, bring the W-H-O-L-E sacrifice. It all has to be brought whole. It has to be a male. We're going to burn it. And he said, this is going to preserve the sacred space, because there is no longer image bearers there. But he's saying in Genesis, now that this woman is brought, now in order for my image to be born there, it's going to take you and her. And I'll say it this way. There's no such thing in Paul the Apostle's mind as a whole man. He's a seed bearer. And I'll say it this much. Only when a woman is pregnant is she considered WHOLE. Now you say, whoa, hang on a second. Now, no, I didn't read that in this commentary. No, I didn't read that in that. I didn't have a divine angel. I'll say it this way. There's no life in us. There's no life. Why would God say, look, if a woman has a period, she's ceremonially unclean. If a man has an emission of semen, he's unceremonially unclean rather. Why is the removal of these liquids creating an uncleanness? Because we're losing wholeness. We're losing it. There's no life in us. Only when a woman has been united with a man and she conceives in her belly, is life forming in her. And I believe that that's why this 40-week period is there, that she is considered whole. She is united with a husband. She is carrying life within her. And that is the process. God has said, man is not eternal. He gets to extend his lineage, but he's going to do it through the woman. So this man's going to beget with this woman and beget this son. This son's going to get with this woman and beget. So in a sense, that's going to take place. But now this is a temporary measure, because there is coming a day when the heavens and the earth are going to be united, and the Eden project is going to cover the whole earth. But until then, this is what is going on with these writers. And this is why we have to say, I didn't know this. I have been misunderstanding it. I'm not trying to pick a fight. I'm not saying, go to your pastor or start fighting with the Baptist faith. I'm not saying that. I'm saying we have to recognize that when we are introduced to the truth of what is being taught, we have to just gravitate to it and say, this is the truth. And this is what the idea of the law was meant to convey, is my people. That these are my people. They're different from the world's people. And during this covenant, I'm going to carve them out of the rest of the world, and I'm going to create laws so that they understand the sacred space that is necessary for me to interact with them. Yes, there is a thread of moral conduct sewn throughout it, but keep this in mind. The idea in ancient Israel to these people, they looked at like, there are sins that you commit you don't even know nothing about. That's what the sacrificial system was for. Guilty things that were done purposely, murder, rape, things that were done with malice, there was no law to pardon that. The law that dealt with that voluntary sin was death. Just kill them. Or there were times that they'd say, drive them out from this collection of people. They're no longer my people. They are like that scapegoat. They call it a scapegoat. But they would say, put your hands on this. It was on the Day of Atonement. That's in Leviticus 16, if you want to go read it. Why would they put their hands on it? He said, look, there's two goats here. Put your hands on this goat. Send that goat out of this camp. Kill that one. Sprinkle that one's blood on the altar, because we need to preserve this sacred space from a whole year of interacting with each other. But why would they take one? And they call it the scapegoat. But in Hebrew, the word is Azazel. Send this goat to Azazel. That's a proper name. And they would say, well, what would they do in transferring their sins and giving that to the devil, Azazel? No, the idea about it was in this camp, it's different than out there. Out there is where death, dismemberment, and all the animals that feed on death. That's their habitat. That's their domain. That's not sacred space. That's where that belongs. We're sending our garbage to where it belongs. Sin is out there, not here. You see the difference? That's why it's so important that you understand Paul is driving home the distinction between the sons of God that left their first abode versus the Son of God who voluntarily came into this place. Now I'll end with this idea of transgression so we can quit for today. I want to say this. Here's what a transgression is. So when you read these words, you need to remember this. In the mind of Paul the Apostle, he looks at something is only righteous when God, the Creator God, manifests it. So just think, this is a crude illustration, but it'll work. Think of an old magician's hat. Remember the rabbit in the hat? If whatever God creates, whatever he manifests, like that rabbit, if he pulls that rabbit out of a hat, the way they're writing is that the rabbit is an act of righteousness that's being manifested for you to see it. That's the idea of the Creator creating, then manifesting whatever that thing is that's been created and manifested. That is what's righteous. So Paul would look at the law and say the law's righteous because it comes from the Creator and it's manifested to us. In that aspect, it's righteous. But now the watchers, their transgression is that what they're trying to accomplish. They're trying to subvert the righteousness of God. They're trying to create something and then point you to it and say, no, this is on par with that. This is equal to that. We are giving you knowledge. You don't know about makeup. You don't know about roots. You don't know how to look at the stars and read the constellations. Our knowledge is being given to you, and what we're manifesting to you is equally righteous. That is what their writing is saying. That mindset is what a transgression is. When the fallen is trying to deviate, steer you away, and that's why Paul is saying somebody is steering you away and then trying to convince you that the law plus the new covenant, you can mingle them together and they will be righteous in doing so. Paul's saying not so fast. No, God is finished with the law. And if you import it into the new covenant, you're transgressing. You cannot do that. That's an act of transgression. That's crossing a boundary. Don't do it. You're getting bewitched. You just don't know it. We're going to continue next week. We're going to look at some of the individual offerings, the peace offering, the sin offering, the guilt offering. So we'll continue on this line next week. Thanks for sharing some of your time with us. We'll see you then.